So welcome to this week's episode of Leadership Soundbites with Roko and Michelle. A lot of discussion around this topic. So this week we're going to do the power of compassion. And Roko and I had, I said, a few conversations about this before we landed on this particular one in this way. So the quote we're going to start off with is one from Prince, and it is, "Compassion is an action word with no boundaries." And so for me, when this topic came up, it was around, for me, initially recognizing that people are going through stuff, right? More than just as a leader, we engage with people in the work environment. And I think the compassion piece for me, and it really surfaced during COVID, was understanding that there's other things going on in our lives that contribute to how people show up at work. And it's important to bring that in. And I think historical, traditional leadership, it was like you had to leave you at the door when you come into work. And to some degree, that's true. But it created this space to realize that we're humans and that humanness is part of who we bring to work every day, and it should be. So what's on your mind?
Yeah. So I love what you were saying in that, during COVID, it helped us realize that other things are contributing to how we show up. And I think that was the first part of our conversation about compassion. And goes back to the definition of compassion. And we had different definitions in our minds, and we went to the dictionary to see what does it actually mean. And, I was more on the empathy side. And so I had thought empathy was the awareness of people's emotions, or wanting to understand what their feelings are about something, what's going on in their lives, and then taking action. And that actually was the definition of compassion. Empathy stopped at the emotion side, having that awareness and understanding and wanting to share in that other person's feelings. And so for me, the quote around it's the action without boundaries, having that first awareness, but then having the willingness and desire to take action on it, it leads to so many things. And that, I think, is where my mind is going now from a leader's perspective. If you don't at least start with empathy and having the awareness, it's difficult to connect on that level with the people who work for you. And I think you hit it when you said it brings humanness into the workplace. I think over the last several years, we've heard a lot about this humanness and human-centered design and things like that. And I love it, because at the core of any business, it's people. I mean, even in the age of all this AI and digital space, at the core, people, behind the scenes, it's people. And if we don't remember that, we will lose that humanness in everything that we do. So that's where my mind went initially when you were talking.
It was interesting because I recently, it was a change management workshop that we did, and we brought in, the backdrop of the workshop was COVID and what went through, because COVID, I think everyone experienced change in COVID. I don't know any of us was immune to it during any kind of change. And so when I think about that, the very defining moments happened, if you think back, in a relatively short period of time, because it was a little over 3 years ago, right? 3 years and change that all that started. And I look at the tolerance that leaders have, that organizations have, right? Because organizational tolerance is made up of individual leadership tolerance. It just gets big enough to where it becomes policy and standard. And so then the organization has tolerance. But to look at people couldn't work from home before. And then when they did work from home, we were dealing with a workforce that they weren't the only ones at home, right? So you talk about before you got up in the morning, you got ready, whatever your routine was, and if you had children, maybe you got them ready for school, you dropped them off at daycare, school, whatever, and you commuted, most of us did, to work, some place that you went to with other humans. We had a routine, right? And then in the blink of an eye, the routine changed. And we talked about it with Paul when we were talking about, the power of disruption. When COVID hit, you were home and people had different circumstances. For me, home, I actually had a space it was my office. I could use as an office. The vast majority of the people didn't have that luxury, right? And so you have people working from dining room tables. Their children are in rooms going to school at the same time. Their significant other or spouse is also working from home if they weren't an essential worker. And I think leaders had to have compassion around what other people were going through, because just because I had an office didn't mean everybody else had an office. Right. So compassion had to step into it a lot. And I think we've gotten better at it and recognize that it's a critical, vital part of leading people, of connecting with people, of engaging with our workforce, is having some understanding for what someone else is going through in their circumstance, because for a lot of people, it hasn't changed. They didn't get a bigger house with an office, but they're still working remotely. So I think it's become more commonplace.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think once you have that awareness, it's like, then you have to ask yourself, what can we do? Right. So whether it's giving people grace around their work environment or their work performance because of their environment and the things that they're having to go through, or giving them different tools to help them through that particular situation. But I think that's where the power is that once you have the awareness, you then have to ask yourself, what can we do? And I don't think it falls completely on the leader to come up with the solutions or the ideas for that. I think it's important to keep the individuals that they're working with involved. They have to be part of the solution. They can't, I don't think it's something that just, top down, here you goes, here's the solution.
Yeah, here it is. We fixed it for you.
I think that's contrary to compassion.
Yeah.
But I think that is the power in it, is that you're connecting those two. And that's, when we initially started talking about this, when I was saying that was the definition of empathy to me, is that it's the marriage of those two parts of having awareness and then taking action, as opposed to just saying, yeah, I can appreciate the situation that you're in, and then leaving that matzo ball out there, yeah, great. She has an appreciation, or he has an appreciation for what I'm going through, but is doing nothing about it. And I think that's where you might disengage people if you go down this path and don't take action. So I do think there's power in having both together and not just one or the other.
And my brain goes to thinking about what kind of action, right, from a leadership perspective, could we take with certain things come up, right? And so that's some of the stuff my brain was going to just now is, so COVID's an example, right? It's the one that we can go through. And I think back to Christopher Mack, the conversation we had around authenticity, right? And he was like, he said now, he's working from home, and if, one of his kids come in and, when he's in a meeting, you're not freaked out about that anymore. Right. It's like, because we have compassion around what someone else is going through, and an appreciation of the fact that our lives are different. Our work lives are different. And so all of a sudden we're not judging, right? Because there's no judgment with compassion. We're not judging somebody else. We're going, I get it. I understand. And the action that we're going to take is not to judge, or to give people grace, to your point, and say, I get it. It's okay. People aren't as mortified when a dog's barking in the background, or the landscape guys outside with a blower going, and, you know, people are like, sorry about the blower, you know, whatever. But we're in a different space now. And it's cool not to have that. It has to be perfect, or this is what it has to be. That we give people freedom to step into more of who they really are. And I think that's part of it too.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm going to play devil's advocate right now.
Yeah.
So there's this struggle that I hear from some leaders around, and we'll stay with the remote kind of working, right? Is how do you know that work's getting done and when to bring them back in the office? And so there's this skepticism around control. And when they're remote, you have less control as a leader, right? So you can be aware of the situation, you can give people grace if that's the action, but at the end of the day, if the business results aren't there, you know, how does that, how do you balance that?
Yeah, it's an interesting animal. So here's what comes to mind for me, right? Is the whole control thing. Is we need to be really clear from my perspective on expectations, right? And so if this is the expectation, right, and you can hit that expectation through remote work and we're fine, great. And the work can get done remote, because not every type of work can get done remotely. So for me, it comes back to manage to expectation first, then have the conversation around what it is, because we're far enough in now that there's not the learning curve that was happening when COVID first hit, right? Because when it first hit, people didn't have workstations set up at home. There was a lot of things that, you know, created this less than ideal working environment. We've had enough time to put those fixes in place. So for me, I think it's going back to the expectations of what work performance standards are. That's one piece. Here's the other thing that I'll say as you're saying that, and I'm, you know, for what I do, I have a hybrid model, right? I go on site and I work with leaders. I also support people remotely. It's a huge upside because it costs organizations less money to have that support. You don't have the drive time. I think you're more productive at work. That being said, we're humans. So the stuff that's surfacing is the need to have, how do you do a hybrid, right? So that people have the in-person touch points, and then they're also able to do remote work and have a better balance in their life, because you're not commuting to whatever that commute time is, right? But for me, I'm going to start with expectations on performance, because that's where we need to start. And
I'm
then,
so glad you said that.
Then we weigh in. Okay, great. So it's a scary question for you. Okay.
Yeah, you know, because I do think there is, you know, it sounds simple, right? Oh, have compassion, understand, and take action. It sounds simple, but there's so many other nuances to the conversation or to the relationship that you're creating, right? And I think that is a component of it, is what are the expectations? And do we have clarity around those expectations and how to measure those expectations, so that when something isn't happening, we can have the conversation about what's going on in your life as well as here at work, so that we can have an appreciation for that situation and then take action. The appropriate action is where my mind is going.
Yeah.
So I didn't want it to seem like, you know, oh, having compassion is, you know, in a silo of itself in the relationship. There's so many other dynamics that feed into it.
Yeah. A conversation that I had recently, and it was around the need to balance the compassion side, the people side, right? All that, and the business side, right? The organization, because because at the end of the day, you also have to be a viable entity, right, as a
Right.
business. And so it's not one exclusive of the other. We have to do both. And it can be a fine dance at times with what that is. But yeah, I think at any given point, we have to start with clear expectations, because otherwise I would go back to problem solving. If you don't know what the end state is, how do you know what gap you're closing?
Right.
So, yeah, that's going to be, so I'm glad I had the right answer.
I don't know if it's the right answer, but it's an answer.
Well, at least one that you were happy with. So, yeah, it's an interesting topic and an interesting, I'm going to say challenge. As a leader, it's an interesting challenge as a leader. Yeah. So, I appreciate time on this topic. So thank you. So what are 1 or 2 things that you would love people to walk away with?
So I think it's the power comes from realizing that people are at the core of everything that we do. And compassion is one more tool in your toolbox as a leader to help you create an environment where relations can flourish. And it's through that understanding of, I need to understand what others are going through or what they're feeling, so that together we can take action.
What came to mind for me was, and I'm just going to say what was in my head, is that compassion is not a weakness.
No.
Because I believe that some people may perceive it that way in terms of leadership, and that there may not be a place for it as a leader. And I'm going to say that is one of the strengths of being a leader. And it's that it is the ability to manage the needs of the business organizational machine and the needs of the people within the organization. So I that's what comes to mind for me, is it is a strength.
Yeah.
So embrace that if you wouldn't mind. I appreciate this time. So this has been Leadership Soundbites with Roko and Michele. Please like, share, subscribe. Until next time. Thank you.
Thank you.